Hello, everybody. We will get started in just a few seconds. Thanks to those who joined early. Cool. Okay. Well, good morning or good evening, wherever you're tuning in from today. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. I am your host, Crystal, and I'm super excited to kick us off. We have a packed session today, and I'm also very excited that we're joined by Solutions 2. And before I hand it off to our speakers, there are a few housekeeping notes to cover. So first, the session is recorded and you will receive the recording within 24-hour post-event via email. If you don't see that email, please feel free to reach out to webinars@criticalstart.com and I'd be happy to assist you. Next, we will be launching polls throughout the session, so make sure to submit your answers once those are launched. And then we also really want this to be an interactive experience, so please use the chat to engage with us, ask questions. We love to hear it from you. And last but definitely not least, we're giving away a $150 Amazon gift card to a lucky attendee. So to enter the drawing, you can simply answer the poll question or ask a question in the chat. All right, so I'll stop talking now and hand it over to our speakers. Tim, I'll have you go first.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you, Crystal. $150. That's pretty generous. I like that. I am dressed in a suit for this webinar, so I look extra special today, or I'm at a cybersecurity conference. It's one of the two. So just a couple quick items about myself before we kick off the presentation. So my name is Tim Bandos. I am the field CISO and also recently the Vice President of Sales Engineering here at Critical Start. We are a vendor agnostic managed detection and response company. But prior to me coming into these roles, I used to work for DuPont Chemical Manufacturing Company. I was the Director of Cybersecurity, so responsible for protecting over 100,000 endpoints. It was an incredible experience. Then I pivoted into the cybersecurity vendor space where I worked at Digital Guardian. I was their CISO and VP of Managed Security Services, where we delivered MDR, EDR, and DLP as a service. And then finally, I wrapped it up with being the CISO and EVP of SOC Services at a company called Exidium, which was formerly Komodo. So I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years and absolutely love it. I'm going to hand the ball over to Jason to introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Jason Nort. I'm the CISO for Solutions 2. My background, while similar, but definitely different than Tim's. I came from the enterprise IT space, worked in end-user IT, responsible for enterprise architecture and enterprise IT operations at various points in my career. Shifted over to the service provider space here at Solutions 2. So we're a services provider and reseller. And I've worn a few different hats here at the Solutions 2 organization, but now leading the cybersecurity and networking practice. So looking forward to talking to everyone today.
Thank you, Jason. So clearly two smart, bald cybersecurity guys. That's a recipe right there. I like to always launch a bit of an icebreaker poll question at the very beginning. What do you think? Whoa, it actually just got my way as soon as you launched it, Crystal. Thank you. What do you think is the biggest reason ransomware actors are targeting the gaming industry? Are they high-value digital assets they're after? Maybe a large user base with personal information, weak security posture from legacy systems? Love to hear from you guys. So as you populate that, we're going to circle back to the answers as you guys populate those polls. All right, let's kick this off. You guys can answer that in the background. So here's a quick agenda today before I hand it over to Jason on his part. I'm going to talk a little bit about ransomware and how it targets the gaming industry. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction, talk about the ransomware life cycle, some key stats and trends that we've observed over the last year or so. What have we seen in the news? Ransomware in the news, and then also talk about best practices for detection and response as it relates to the gaming industry and how we can thwart these ransomware campaigns. This is an AI generated picture. I said, hey, give me a generated picture of ransomware targeting a casino, and this is what it spit out. Not bad. I feel like it could do a little bit better, but I like kind of the digital look of that. Interesting. So let's get into talking about ransomware. What does that life cycle look like? And a lot of times it's very similar, attack after attack. An individual, group or organization, or even an individual entity will initiate the attack. The attacker is going to begin by, developing their code. Maybe they're leveraging ransomware as a service where everything's pre-built for them to get into a particular organization. They might even purchase access to an organization to then launch their campaign. So there's a variety of options. So essentially the barrier for entry is very low for ransomware attackers these days. And this is why we're seeing this out in the wild more and more, especially as the years go on. So once they identify maybe their target that they're specifically going after, they look for something to exploit. Maybe it's an externally facing remote desktop protocol server that has credentials that are weakened, or then it doesn't have MFA applied to those RDP systems. Maybe they're sending out phishing email campaigns, and hopefully an individual clicks on those links or attachments. So it's a variety of different methods of how they're infiltrating organizations, but that is typically one of the first steps, right, of getting into a particular entity. Then once they get into that organization, they're going to do a little bit of recon. They're going to identify maybe some data that they want to exfiltrate, so that they can launch an extortion campaign on top of encrypting the data, once they get into a company. So there's a variety of different tactics that ransomware operators will leverage, but that's, one component is looking for information that is sensitive. Maybe it's personal information, maybe it's trade secret information, maybe it's something, the company does not want to be exposed to the outside world, but they leverage these data points to ensure payment or successful payment for their target. Once they then activated their ransomware campaign, they will fully deploy to a segment of the network and start encrypting those systems. And unfortunately, at this point, a lot of times it's a little too late. It can be incredibly difficult to restore from backups, and sometimes it takes a long time. So a lot of organizations think through, well, should I pay this ransomware request? That might get me up and running. For some organizations, uptime is absolutely critical to their operations. I remember when I was working at DuPont, we had one of these servers in a manufacturing facility. The uptime for this one particular server, if it went down, it was costing us 10,000 USD per hour. So that adds up, over the course of time. So, when you think about that, that's a lot of times why organizations, ultimately make that decision, so that they can get up and running quickly. And then, they look for that payment and recovery. So let's talk a little bit about stats, things that we're seeing. Over the last year, 59% of organizations were hit over this past year. And that's an incredible number. Whether that's opportunistic, they see these low-hanging fruits, or even targeted in nature, close to 60% and on. That's a pretty high number. And then 70% of those attacks resulted in data encryption. So it might not always result in encryption. It's good to see that maybe cybersecurity tools actually did their job and prevented encryption or the ransomware being deployed. A lot of times what I've seen from different incident response campaigns is they'll look to disable maybe the endpoint detection response tool or the antivirus tool. If they're targeting Microsoft, they'll attempt to disable Windows Defender, and if they're successful, they then deploy. But ransomware operators will always look for their greatest kind of ability to deploy the tools that they have at their own discretion. So making sure that everything has been disabled or is allowed to actually execute and run is one of the first things that they'll do when they get into an environment. And then 32% of those attacks started with an unpatched vulnerability. So whether it's, like I said, vulnerabilities that can be exploited, or even just phishing campaigns, there's a variety of different methods that ransomware operators are leveraging. A couple more statistics we're seeing: 97% of those organizations actually got their information back. I mean, this is the business model. It would not be a good business model to not actually hand back over the data, because then nobody would pay. So that's why we see such a high number there on the 97%. And then 67%, we've seen an increase in new ransomware groups being formed. I think a lot of that can be attributed to that, as I mentioned earlier, that low barrier to entry. You don't need to be a coder anymore. You don't even need to build your own ransomware, or even infiltrate organizations themselves. You can already buy all of this access and access to tools. This is all readily available for those particular groups. So this is why we're also seeing a large increase in numbers of those ransomware groups, because they can be incredibly successful. And then 58% companies had to shut down operations after an attack for an average of 12 hours. This is it's significantly impacting organizations. I've seen even small dental offices, or even auto dealership type organizations where they don't necessarily have the funding to, have a CISO, have a security operations center team, have all the latest and greatest tools available to them. And when they get hit with ransomware, it can be absolutely detrimental, to that particular company. So it's sad. And then 32% of the companies had ultimately paid the ransom. And I think this number is actually going down a little bit. We've seen initially, that is the knee-jerk reaction, let's pay this thing off. But now companies maybe are a little bit more resistant to that, making sure that they have, good incident response plans in place. I think that's incredibly important to have a good IR plan in place to do those tabletop exercises. We can talk a little bit about that later. I know Jason's going to cover that too, but it is very important to be prepared when you have these particular incidents that are, occurring. Some of the top ransomware groups that we are seeing, it's good to know your adversary, but it's also good to track, what the capabilities are of these different organizations and their TTPs, their tactics and techniques of how they infiltrate organizations so that you can better prepare yourself and make sure you cover a lot of those gaps. So RansomHub, Lockbit, Play, Akira, Hunters, these are all the different groups that we've seen, targeting organizations over the last year or so. So just good to do your research and understand from a threat intelligence perspective what the capabilities are of each of these operators. So in the news, we talk about, think about from a gaming perspective in the casino industry, there's no industry that is left out when it comes to ransomware. And, the casino business, the gaming industry, they're no different, right? We saw with MGM Resorts in 2023, $100 million. The Las Vegas company had to pay out in order to, restore their operations and pay, unfortunately, that ransom. So all that adds up. But it's not just large entities like MGM. It's also smaller organizations too. Like cybersecurity incident hits Minnesota tribal community, right? Completely hobbled the casino. Or Rivers Casino in Philadelphia, reaching out to those impacted after a data breach, which was associated also with ransomware. So, unfortunately, this is what's happening and occurring, and this is what, this is the reality of, trying to be prepared when these incidents do occur. If we look at the MGM Resorts incident timeline, it all started off with information gathering. What we put out on the web about ourselves, for example, on LinkedIn or social media sites, that's all being leveraged in an attack. So info about MGM employees and contractors was gathered via social media, and then high-ranking employees and contractors with privileged access into MGM were ultimately being targeted. This isn't the first time. It makes sense for these operators to target those who have administrative credentials, who have, the keys to the kingdom, if you will, because you're going to get obviously the best access you can by targeting those individuals, and allows you to essentially pivot throughout the whole network. So then hackers begun to spoof IT support vendors employed by MGM, and the bad actors were impersonating those users and were ultimately able to get into Okta, which is incredibly unfortunate. We leverage Okta for multi-factor authentication and to protect us against these types of attacks. But when you leverage kind of that social engineering component or aspect, it's very easy to fall down short when that human element is at play. Then IT vendors reset the MFA of targeted hackers. Hackers use that access and compromise more admin accounts. They acquired domain administrator credentials. They moved throughout the network, and they were able to ultimately deploy the ransomware. So this is an unfortunate incident timeline, but this is how MGM was ultimately infiltrated. This is just a general ransomware deployment type case. A lot of times this is, what we'll see when, they develop, an infection, they look for a particular exploit. Once they've exploited, that particular entity, then they leverage other tools like Cobalt Strike or, credential harvesting type programs. They'll start, moving laterally. They'll establish persistence in the environment. They'll tamper with Microsoft Defender, as I mentioned earlier. That's a huge, win for them if they're able to disable, the antivirus unit, because without that protection, it's going to allow anything to essentially execute. So once everything's been exploited and they start moving laterally, and then they, acquire complete access to your entire VM environment, it's game over. And, at that point, there's really no going back. So this is how, or what it looks like from a ransomware deployment perspective. And timing wise, this could take anywhere from an hour to 2 hours to even sometimes 2 to 3 days. I've seen ransomware operators take their time once they've gotten into an organization and they do the reconnaissance, they scan the environment. They want to make sure they have the largest impact that they can on that entity. So really, it kind of depends on the group that's targeting that particular company, but this is typically how that attack plays out. And I don't know if you guys remember, but years ago, not too many years ago, but criminals hacked a fish tank to steal data from a casino. So you also have to think about, internet connected devices, IoT devices, should I connect my fish tank to the internet, which potentially contains vulnerabilities? A lot of times these IoT devices are not built with security in mind. Maybe they have default, username and passwords on it that allows an attacker to leverage that to get into the network. So they leverage it as pivot points. And unfortunately, this is a particular case where, data was exfiltrated due to, that casino fish tank. Which is incredibly unfortunate, right? So we have these assets too out in the maybe out in your environment that you might not even be aware of, that they have this vulnerability, that they're connected to the network. And that's why it's important to do asset discovery. It's important to leverage those tools to make sure that you've covered all your access points. So that kind of leads me into talking about OT, technology, IoT technology environments, and how to monitor them. If we look at a tool like Dragos or Clarity or Nozomi, Dragos did some, ransomware studies over the last year or so, and they've seen, this continued evolution, right, of the ransomware threat, and they've been tracking, how ransomware operators get in and how they target manufacturing facilities and OT environments. That's why, if you have an OT style environment, or maybe an environment with IoT devices, having that additional layer of visibility and protection is critical. These types of schools do a great job at decoding industrial control, type protocols, kind of all the protocols that you'd see in an OT style environment. And with that visibility, then you can take action, start preventing these types of, techniques from being deployed. Now, obviously, the best option when you have these types of environments is segmenting them, making sure that you have a firewall in place and that you don't have direct access from the internet, or it's segmented off via a DMZ. But these are the types of things you need to think about architecturally, in order to protect those different types of environments. So what we do at Critical Start is kind of make sense of all the different log sources that environment has, whether in the gaming industry or even just any industry in general. We're consuming all this information. We're consuming firewall traffic, MFA traffic, EPP, identity auth, cloud security, but they're not all created equal in terms of prioritization and what you would want to specifically focus on. The value of these logs are all different, right? In terms of, what is my ROI on collecting these types of logs, and what can give me the most bang for my buck? This is how we bucketize it. It's not to say that everything to the right is, incredibly low, and we don't look at that. We still look at alerts that get generated from those different data sources. But if you look at, email security, VPN, EPP, AV style stuff, that's going to give you the greatest visibility into what's going on in your environment. So at Critical Start, we focus on those different data sources as we're analyzing and monitoring an environment, and make sure that we have response mechanisms in place when suspicious activity occurs in those, because then we can start isolating devices, resetting usernames and passwords, maybe removing emails that have phishing links or attachments in them. So this is why it's important to understand what your data sources are, and then how to prioritize them from a monitoring perspective. And then it's also important to talk a little bit about alert reduction. Kind of wrapping up here with a couple more slides. I'm going to hand it over to Jason. But, as you look at the information that is being ingested, there's a level of tuning and whitelisting that needs to be applied to that. You don't want to be constantly analyzing the same false positives over and over again. You want to tune and whitelist that, because that's normal behavior. Once you've enriched that information, you've looked at it behaviorally and contextually, you start to profile it, the different users and entities. Maybe you understand the IT admins are executing specific types of tools like PS exec, and you develop rules that allow them to execute that within certain parameters, maybe during certain timeframes. But anything outside of those time ranges, that's when you generate an alert. So it's incredibly important to contextually understand your environment and then respond accordingly when something anomalous does occur. Leveraging the MITRE ATT&CK framework for correlating that activity. MITRE is fantastic at breaking down literally every single entrance vector of a potential attack and all the TTPs associated with the different adversaries. But once you've injected that information kind of into the mapping of alerts, it really provides that additional context that helps kind of pivot through and hunt through the data to identify when you have those anomalies. And that's that 1% of raw events. I would say 90% of the alerts that get generated a lot of times in SOC environments, right, in the SOC team, are legitimate. They're items that can be whitelisted. Then 9% is maybe particular to your business. It's maybe something contextually that you've created PowerShell scripts to execute and that looks suspicious, but maybe it's something that can be whitelisted. And there's that 1 to 2%, maybe 2%, 1% that you want to actually investigate. So this is how we kind of apply our approach to analyzing the data at scale when you're looking at all the different events that come in. So we look at low, medium, highs and criticals, and we triage every single alert because that's incredibly important. You can't leave anything out. So some keys and trends and observations that we've seen, just to kind of wrap it up from a ransomware perspective, with more than 75 active groups, it's evidence that launching ransomware campaigns, it's still a relatively, little effort is required. It almost seems like any group can become a ransomware operator, which is unfortunate. So it's made it incredibly easy for them to come in. From a persistence perspective, we're seeing groups like RansomHub, Lockbit, Play. They're leveraging advanced extortion tactics and techniques. It's not just a single play of encrypting your data. It's also holding your information and also saying, hey, I'm going to release this if you don't pay. So that persistence and dominance is playing out, unfortunately. And that's ultimately what's enabling organizations to pay up the ransom. We also obviously see this increased transparency with organizations self-reporting about breaches. In the past, you wouldn't really hear too much about it unless it was a major breach of ransomware and operations went down and then you had to report to the news. But I do think it's important for entities, for organizations to share intelligence, because this is ultimately how we go up against the threat actors and prevent them from being successful. So intel sharing and being in that industry is incredibly important, at least from that perspective. And then obviously the rise of double and triple extortion, as I mentioned, that's just tactics that we're going to continue to see evolve, I think, over the coming years. So what can we do about it? From a recommendations perspective, a protections perspective, implement a risk-based vulnerability management program. This is incredibly important. Prioritizing what needs to be patched. If you purchase a Qualys or a Tenable, and you start scanning all your devices, the first thing you see are going to be like 59,000, different alerts of maybe, high criticals that you need to address. That isn't always the case. From a vulnerability prioritization perspective, it's important to understand too what vulnerabilities are even being exploited out in the wild. Are botnets being leveraged, or ransomware, campaign operators, looking to exploit these vulnerabilities? That kind of brings into play prioritization, because if you can identify what are the 10% or those 10 patches that could reduce my likelihood by 80% or 90%, that's incredibly important. So it's important to have that risk-based management program, vulnerability management program. Focus on patching those actively exploited vulnerabilities, ensuring that your MDR or your SOC team has the ability to also integrate with EDR. So identifying, isolating, and remediating becomes a lot easier. So having those direct integrations is incredibly important, especially when time is of the essence. If a device, let's say a domain controller, or there's a device that's exhibiting credential dumping programs from Mimikatz. Obviously, Mimikatz should be stopped by an antivirus solution. But if something is stopped or prevented that allows it to execute, it's important to respond to those devices immediately. So being able to isolate as soon as possible is important. I can't say this enough around requiring MFA for all remote access and administrative accounts and sensitive internal applications. We see this far too often where MFA is not enabled on those externally facing devices, or a server that's being accessed from the internet. If an attacker is able to brute force their way in, they're going to, unfortunately. So making sure that you have that additional layer of protection is very important. And then provide ongoing security awareness training, especially with individuals who are known to click on links and attachments. That's why it's good to have those white hat phishing campaigns where you send out suspicious looking emails. In the age of AI that's coming, ransomware operators are going to leverage AI more and more to make those emails look perfect. So it's important to make sure that those phishing emails, those test phishing emails, also look like that as well, so they see what the real world attack looks like these days. I remember back in 2012, 2011, some of the phishing emails that came across my desk, I'm like, how does someone even click on these things? Like, it was broken English, the sentence didn't even make sense, yet people were still clicking. So you can only imagine what the click rate is today when something does look incredibly legitimate. So I think that security awareness component is very, very important. And then maintain, segmented backups that are offline and segmented, from your environment. That's incredibly important. Do not connect those networks, because I've seen ransomware operators also target the backups when they were connected. But having that additional control in place, from a business continuity perspective, is imperative, right, to be successful there. So That's my kind of shtick on ransomware. Those were my recommendations. I would love to hear from Jason on his side of the house. Jason, if you'd like to share out your screen and go through that, we would love to hear from you as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Let me get that thrown up here. And I completely agree with you. And MFA all the things. We're seeing way too many organizations that are not MFAing all the things, and it definitely creates a problem for organizations when and creates a vulnerability that hackers are able to exploit. But anyway, so I'm here to talk about lessons learned from incident response. So it's kind of interesting. Tim has been talking about ransomware and a lot of things that I would consider kind of left of boom. And I'm going to pivot into, okay, what happens when all of those fail safes and all your planning and all the security controls that you've invested a ton of money into, they've been bypassed in some way, shape, or form. The proverbial user that has way too many privileges has clicked the link that has caused something to be exploited. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the lessons learned from incident response. We've been engaged many times over the last couple of years to help organizations with incident response and our recovery post-event. Many of these organizations already had an incident response plan. However, the one thing that many of these events have shown us is that most enterprises are woefully underprepared when faced with a large-scale incident that, like a ransomware or a business email compromise or other cyber attack that basically is impacting their critical business operations. I've worked with many orgs. They've executed their incident response plan, and they're usually only a couple steps in where they realize, oh, we've got a gap here. And then it's everybody kind of looking around, staring at each other going, okay, what next? And then you end up with a bunch of different competing priorities and a lot of different opinions on what to do next. So that's what we're going to talk about. Most of what I'm going to be showing you today is by not only working through a live incident, but also sitting in a lot of postmortems and discussing detailed lessons learned, what should be done better, and then aggregating all that information into kind of a top 5. What are the top 5 things that we should do? All right. And with that being said, I'm going to jump right into it. So number 1, have an IR retainer in place. In the event of a large-scale cyber attack, you want someone that you can partner with and lean on to work through that incident. Whether it is consultative advice, additional manpower, or in some cases, you may want to outsource the entire incident response to a third party. I can tell you internally at Solutions 2, we partner with Critical Start, and Critical Start is both my MDR SOC services provider, as well as I have an incident response retainer in place with Critical Start, and they are a great partner, and they have been fantastic to work with. But the interesting thing about it is, sure, you can wait and reach out to someone and get incident response help after an incident without having a retainer in place, but it changes everything. The biggest impact it has to you is time. Threat actors are not going to sit around and wait while you go get your contract in place and engage with someone. They're moving fast, and this is a situation where hours, and in many cases, minutes actually matter. So the threat actors are not waiting for contracts. The other advantage you have by having an IR retainer in place is you've already got pre-negotiated terms. So you already know what this is going to cost the organization. You've planned for that. Your CFO, your CEO, they're involved. They know what is at stake, and they're prepared to essentially spend that funding when needed versus waiting till after an incident. The other thing it does for you is it gives you faster response times. It gives you that one throat to choke. It gives you that 800 number that you can call and engage with someone to get help and assistance. And it also kind of forces you as the organization to kind of think through roles. Who's doing what? When I call that 800 number, who's answering on the other end, and what are they going to be doing from that point forward after they've answered. The absolute worst time to try to find someone to partner with in a situation like this is during a crisis. This is not, I've received the call many times where someone is experiencing a live incident and they're essentially going through their Rolodex or their contact list looking for, and I'm dating myself by using the term Rolodex there, but they're going through their contact list and they're just calling whoever they can get on the phone at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday night. That is not the time when you want to be trying to find someone to partner with during an incident or crisis. And then last but not least, if you have an IR retainer, have that documented somewhere in an offline format. Have that number saved in your cell phone, have that printed out, thumbtacked to the wall, know how to engage that IR partner. I've talked to many clients where they have an IR retainer, they have cyber insurance, but all the information on how to contact and engage with those partners was encrypted in the ransomware event. And so there's hours lost just while they're trying to uncover and figure out how to re-engage with their cyber insurance or IR firm. This is essentially that takeaway on the side right there. Just one decision. Any one of these decisions that you're making ahead of time is helping your incident response plan. It's helping you engage and move faster, which is going to reduce the blast radius from the cyber attack. Containment is step 0. This is, I have been engaged by firms where, or by clients and organizations that have a live cyber event. And while the security team is still trying to contain the threat, IT has started trying to do recovery operations. This is a sequence of events. These are typically not things that you want done in parallel unless you have planned for it and you have a method to securely recover your systems. You have to contain the threat actor. Once you discover that a threat actor is in your environment, you really just have to assume that they're everywhere in your environment. There really is not a safe place in your organization once you have like ransomware widespread in your organization. You have to assume compromise, assume breach. So containment is step 0. You have to do that first. You also want to develop and test your run books. And I cannot recommend highly enough that when that worst case scenario happens and you have a wide scale outage, having the plan and knowing how to disconnect your network from the internet is critically important. 10 years ago, someone would run into the data center and unplug the internet. It was just that simple. Nowadays, it's not that simple. We have multiple sites. We have people working from home. We all have cloud applications. And so there's typically not just a cable to unplug. So if you want to shut down and prevent authentication into all of your different workloads, wherever those are hosted, and you want to kill the threat actor's access, it's typically a complex scenario. You need a runbook developed for that. Not only do you need the runbook, but you need to have empowered someone to make that decision. I have seen organizations where they know how to disconnect all of the things, but they haven't clearly defined who gets to make that call when that event happens. So they're right of boom, the threat actors running rampant in their environment, encrypting one system after another, and they're doing an escalation tree trying to track someone down that can execute or authorize someone to click the button to execute the runbook to disconnect the threat actor from everything in the environment. So have the runbook and have the people empowered to make the decision and make the call. And last but not least, make sure when you do that, that you're also not disconnecting all your security tools. Most of our security tools today rely on being able to talk to the internet in some way, shape, or form. If you think about any of the modern endpoint solutions that we all run on our endpoints, they all have to talk to some kind of management system that is typically cloud hosted. You can safely disconnect everything and leave a pathway for your security tools to still connect to the internet. Don't forget that. This is all, the key point here is you want to make all of these decisions left of boom so that when the threat actor, the boom does occur, you can execute these actions and be in a safe spot. This one probably should have been number one lesson learned. I have talked to many organizations that have CISOs, they have full security organizations, they have very mature IT operations, and there has been some very false assumptions made. Maybe they have an IR partner, but there's been assumptions made about what that IR team is doing. If you think about a widespread ransomware event like Tim was talking about, typically what your IT environment, your business IT operations look like right of boom is kind of a smoking crater. If you're bringing an IR firm in to help you, their number one goal is contain the threat actor. And then typically they have priorities that, in a sequence of events that they start working through that involves doing forensics, evidence collection, shoring up security controls, trying to assess the impact of the event. Was data egressed out of your firm? Are you potentially going to have to do disclosure notifications to your employees, to your clients, etc.? That is the normal scope of operations for an IR team. And they can essentially finish their engagement, and your IT business operations are still a smoking crater. Albeit there's not a threat actor potentially. The threat actor has now been contained, but your organization is not functional. So recovery operations typically falls onto your IT team and or another third-party firm. And so understanding those roles when you start your IR plan is really critical. And it's typically different disciplines and different teams that are running through that. As I mentioned, forensics, they're doing containment. They're trying to assess the root cause and overall impact. Recovery efforts are restoring systems to resume business operations. Define who's going to be doing what. So understand if you have an IR and IR retainer already engaged and you have a contract, understand what that includes. Understand the scope of that IR engagement. If IT systems recovery is not part of their engagement, you need to define who that is. And if it's an internal resources, have IT recovery runbooks and when those runbooks should be executed. Tim already referenced this. Backups must be immutable and recoverable. I have worked with many organizations that are using, I will just say, next-gen data backup systems that absolutely have immutable data, and that can be proven time and time again. I've also seen situations where the organization has been completely locked out of said backup system. So the threat actor, so there's some next-gen backup system with immutable data, but that system is on the domain, or to access that system, it's using a non-MFA'd account to log in. It's using default credentials, God forbid. And threat actors, that's target 1 or target 0 for a threat actor at this point. It didn't used to be, but at this point, threat actors are smart, intelligent people. They want to prevent the recovery of your systems. And so that's usually target 0 that they're going to go after, is that backup data. So making sure your backup recovery system is hardened, the backup data itself is immutable and can't be changed, and then making sure it can be recoverable. Another situation that I've seen before is where you have your backup data, but you don't have a place to restore it to. Potentially, depending on your organization, you're having to do forensics and evidence collection. Therefore, the systems that you would normally host some application or business critical system, it can't be recovered to because you're still going through forensics for regulatory or law enforcement or whatever is necessary. So you need a place to recover to. So make sure that's part of your plan, that you have a spot plan to recover. Test these restore procedures regularly and realistically. Doing a partial system recovery or data recovery in a lab environment is just not sufficient. That's good as a step 1, but you really need to do full system recovery, including all the dependencies for that business critical application. Please, please, please define a priority on how these things are recovered. Most of our backup and recovery solutions that we leverage in today's environment, they do not have the ability to do, while they may be able to recover in parallel streams, that's not infinite. So you really need to define what are your top 5 things that need to be recovered. And the reality is there may be 5 or 6 things that have to be recovered just for that one business critical application to function. Not to mention, do you have 7 other business critical applications that are also failing and also need to be recovered? So define what that restore priority should be. Do some testing. Understand what recovery time looks like so that you can effectively communicate back to the business a real world answer. I've seen many organizations test in a lab environment with no other competing workloads that they can have something back up and running within, we'll call it 3 hours. And the reality is, in a real world scenario with everything that's going on the network and all the other recovery streams that are happening, that recovery looks more like 12 hours. And that is not something you want to go back to your CEO and explain, well, actually, in this situation, it's not going to be 12 hours, not the 3 hours I committed to you earlier today. So understanding what that looks like in a real world situation. While you're left of boom and planning and testing this out, look for single points of failure. If all of your recovery efforts depend on that one person in your IT team that is kind of has been around for a few years and kind of knows how everything works and has all the tribal knowledge, that's a single point of failure. Identify that knowledge that person has or that resource has, and get that documented such that when you're in a situation where you're in a crisis, you can enter recovery operations without depending on one single resource's knowledge. This is another one that I see very frequently, even with organizations that have some kind of asset management system, etc. A lot of times that knowledge of someone's environment and the application dependencies and where all the data repositories are and where the identity integrations are, a lot of times that is still tribal knowledge that exists within a very small handful of resources within your IT and security team. Get that information down on paper. Define what your tier 0 is, and that typically is your compute, storage, and networking. But then think about those other tier 0 services that run on top of that. Think about your identity layer, Active Directory, other network services, DNS, and some organizations, and I fully support this, NTP, just or time services are super critical. So defining that, knowing where those things are running, and how to recover those things, and communicating to the business that, yes, we understand that this application is mission critical, but that can't be restored until tier 0 is restored. And what's your tier 0 recovery time? I mean, for many organizations, that may be somewhere between 4 to 12 hours. So knowing that you have a 4 to 12 hour window of once you hit go of recovering your tier 0 before you can even start mission critical application restoration is really important. And your time may be different, but understanding what your time is for your environment is really important. Having that documented inventory, having the workload dependencies mapped out, not only is that helping you with recovery efforts, but your incident response team is going to be asking these questions when you engage them. So if you can segment these, in a perfect world, we're segmenting all these things left of boom. During a live incident, sometimes it's possible to still save some of these mission critical applications, but your incident response team, they have to be operating from a place of knowledge. You have to be able to give them accurate information about your asset inventory and workload dependencies and where those things are running, what security controls are involved in protecting those things. And you can work with your IR team in some cases to help save some of those things before they're impacted. Just to hammer this point home, define these systems and their dependencies before the boom, not during the crisis. I cannot stress that enough. And I think I have time to jump into one bonus, bonus lesson learned this is probably one that I've seen. You have to remember that during an incident, in many cases, this is the first real high stress crisis that your IT team, your security team has worked on. Maybe they've worked a small ransomware event, maybe they've dealt with a phishing incident, etc., at a small scale, but a large scale enterprise outage where none of your systems are working, that is probably the most stressful work situation that any of us are ever going to face. Understanding that fatigue is real, and people cannot work for 36 hours, 48 hours straight and still make sound decisions. I've seen this time and time again where it's an all hands business IT operations for the first day and a half or 2 days of an event. And then organizations want to start moving into shift work. Well, you end up with gaps in coverage. And that, one person in your environment that has all the tribal knowledge, at some point they have to sleep. And that sleep needs to be more than 15 or 30-minute cat nap at their desk. They need rest. They're exhausted. And plan for this. You can start looking at one of the things that typically starts happening is you start seeing finger pointing and blame, snark and sarcasm, because this is the worst situation most of us are dealing with at work. All of our worst traits come out during these incidents, and people are burnt out. So look for those things. Watch for the warning signs. Make sure people are fed. Make sure people are hydrated. Make sure people are getting rest. As a takeaway, predetermined roles and responsibilities. Make sure who has decision-making power. Make as many of these decisions left of boom as possible. And then probably the most important thing on this slide is try to avoid the war room situations where you have all of the business resources on the same call as your IT and security resources. Set up separate war rooms for the technical team versus the business team. Let the business define net priorities and let the IT and security team execute on those priorities. And then have someone to liaise between the two war rooms. That can be different resources within the organization. Sometimes that's the CIO. Other times it's an incident response commander. But define who those people are and separate those calls, because the last thing your IT sysadmin needs is the CEO breathing down their neck after they've been working 24 hours straight trying to recover some incident, and they're trying to explain some technical situation or what's happening with an irate CEO who's just trying to get his business back up and running, his or her business back up and running. But anyway, those are the takeaways. And if there are other further questions around this, please let us know. I'm throwing a slide up here that has some of our peer groups and ways to contact us. If you'd like to reach out to me, my email address is on here. But these are the lessons learned from working many cyber incident response calls over the last couple of years. And hopefully this is provides some value back to you.
That was great, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, I have a question for you. I guess before we go to the question line, why don't we have a question from the host? If you guys have a customer with a retainer with you, what's typically your response time when an incident does happen? What does that look like?
So with someone that has a retainer, that's usually within minutes. There's someone's engaged, and depending on and I've seen a lot of different retainers that are formed differently, but in a perfect world, your incident response team has a lot of information. They've already access and out-of-band communications, and all of those things have all been predefined. And so that response time can be down to something like minutes. Conversely, if there's no defined retainer in place, there's things like MSAs that have to be created. There's statements of work that have to be created. Then there's getting sign off from CEO and CFO, and depending on the organization, buy-in. And all of that is, of course, made incredibly difficult if your email systems are and communication systems are encrypted and unavailable.
Yep. So lesson learned, be prepared ahead of the incident.
Right.
I like that.
That's right.
That's good.
Yeah.
So Crystal, do we have any questions on the chat line?
Yes, we do. Thank you, first of all, to Tim, Jason, you both for your wonderful presentations. A few questions in the chat. So first, the gaming industry is uniquely sensitive to latency and uptime. How does your MDR service differentiate between a sophisticated DDoS attack and a massive legitimate influx of players during a game launch or event?
Feels like a ChatGPT question. Someone put ChatGPT up to this because that was like worded flawlessly. Yeah, no, it's easy to, I think differentiate obviously the types of attacks that are inbound, from an alert perspective. As we're triaging alerts and they're coming in, one thing that we are incredibly careful with is, impact to operations, impact to business. We've got incredibly, direct and deep integrations with a lot of security technologies today that enable us to quickly respond and isolate and shut down affected devices without impacting those operations or those servers or systems that need to retain uptime. It kind of depends, right, if something needs to be segmented but while still being up. But we work a lot of times with our customers to understand what those tier 0, tier 1 devices are that are critical to their business, so that when we do engage during an incident response or during just the day-to-day triage, making sure that we aren't once again taking something down that shouldn't be. So I think it really just comes down to contextually understanding the environment and then avoiding kind of those rules of engagement, terms of engagement that we don't want to once again disrupt.
Yeah, I
Awesome.
think that, yeah, just to pile on, Crystal, with what Tim just said, as a consumer of Critical Start's MDR services, I think that's one of the key differentiators is that custom rules of engagement and defining all of that, not only during the initial onboarding, but as business operations change. So at this point, I've been consuming Critical Start services for years. Obviously, my back-end IT systems and application workloads and stuff have shifted over time. And so being able to continually communicate and share that information so that the rules of engagement and what Critical Start's MDR team is empowered to do on what systems and what user identities versus others, and keeping that up to date it's just like keeping your incident response plan up to date.
That's good. Nice. Thanks for the shout out,
Awesome.
Jason. I like that.
Second question. Gaming companies have high volume data sources like game service logs, anti-cheat telemetry. How does the Critical Star MDR service ingest and make sense of this custom data?
Yeah, that's working, with your organization to understand what that data even is. Is there anything security relevant that we can obtain out of that? Is there anything that we can define from a detections perspective that looks for that anomalous behavior within that telemetry? So it really comes down to custom data sources, and we'll do that for you. I know during the presentation slide I talked about the security relevance of each type of data source and how we bucketize that from a value added perspective, like an ROI side of the house. So in the gaming industry, there are going to be, potentially data sources that we don't typically see on a day-to-day basis, but we will take that information in, analyze it, and understand where those anomalies and trends are so that we can effectively respond and identify when there is something that needs, requires further investigation. But that's an absolutely great question. A lot of MDR providers might not even support that if it's, custom or third party or something they don't traditionally see. We like to work with our customers to make sure that we are providing, the most value we can. And that's a perfect example of a telemetry that we could take in and customize it. Yep.
Awesome. Next question. How does your incident response process support a gaming company in a high pressure scenario?
Ooh, that's for you, Jason.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's by incorporating all the lessons learned and then some. So I think gaming is a regulated environment. It's high pace, high impact IT operations. The entire business is completely dependent on the underlying IT operations. There's also typically a heavy amount of IoT devices in play. And so it's really by doing as much pre-planning as possible. We've absolutely engaged with gaming organizations where there's been a lack of pre-planning, and some of that planning is having to occur during a live incident or during a live crisis. And you know, I guess the best way to do it is by incorporating all those lessons learned and planning out as much of this left to boom before the threat actor has the opportunity to impact your operations.
I love that. And then some.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions, so that brings us to the end of our session. I will launch the last poll, and leave it up for a minute. So let me do that. And then in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope you all walk away with valuable takeaways. Tim, Jason, any final thoughts before we conclude?
I just, want to thank Jason too for joining the webinar. I think it's fantastic to hear, from him on their insight and how they, conduct incident response. Incident response is absolutely incredible, absolutely imperative, right? And incredible, of course, but imperative to have, pre-planned, as Jason even mentioned, making sure you have those retainers in place and making sure you've done those tabletop exercises and that you make sure that you're, testing your backup process. I mean, you couldn't have nailed it, any clearer, for the audience. So, thanks again, Jason, for your insight. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tim, for covering everything you did about ransomware and its impact on both gaming organizations as well as non-gaming organizations. The threat is real, and the reality is this is not a question of if, but when. We're all going to be faced with some kind of cyber event if you haven't already been. And I think it's through partnership in our community that we can all tackle the cyber problem together. So thanks for the support, Tim.
That was good. All right, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.